The map in your head is a habit, not a law. You spread it on the table and point to borders that look permanent, as if rivers carved them. But permanence is just repetition that forgot its origin story. The Americas you know are not inevitable. You feel it the moment you reach a checkpoint and watch two flags snap in the same wind, each insisting on a line that could have been a seam instead. You walk toward the glass, passport in hand, preloading your smile for the customs officer. Imagine the booklet you raise isn't national blue, but a deep shared red-brown, stamped with a crown seal you've never seen. Hispanic Commonwealth. The line to your left says domestic, and it stretches from Tijuana to Tierra del Fuego. Your surname sounds less like a leftover from a lost century and more like a key that still fits. Your football rivalry shifts from a country versus country fist clench to a league that crosses oceans and time zones. Real Lima away at Boca Cádiz on a humid Wednesday night. Your taxes don't vanish into a capital you will never visit. They ride steel and copper south on a grid that binds coasts and mountains. Shave a few pesos off your power bill. Keep rice and oil from spiking when storms close a strait. If you love sharp, cinematic what-ifs, subscribe to What If Wars. You're here for stories that breathe on the neck of what really happened and then ask what it would take to hold that breath longer. You step outside the terminal and the air tastes like salt and diesel. Street vendors speak Spanish, yes, but also Quechua, to a grandmother buying fruit, and Guarani, to a kid arguing the price of a sticker. You hail a car and pay with a currency that doesn't lurch every election cycle because it's pegged to a market bigger than any one president's temper. The driver asks if you're going north or south, and, for once, both directions feel like home. You look up at a billboard that isn't selling you escape. It's selling you passage. No visa needed, just your shared passport and a ticket you can afford. And yet, you don't trust easy dreams. You know every empire bleeds on logistics, law, money, and pride. You know distance kills more than war does. You know a caste system can strangle loyalty. That silver can both fund a state and hollow it out. That rival powers don't watch a hemisphere without reaching for it. You want proof that any alternate present deserves your belief. You want to feel the weight of cables under oceans, the ink of laws that outlive coups, the dull rhythm of taxes collected and budgets balanced. You don't want magic. You want mechanisms that click. So here's the promise. We won't conjure a miracle. We will take a signature that should have mattered and make it bite. We will lay wire where there was wind and steam, and sail iron where wood once drowned. We will show you how a passport becomes more than paper, how a league becomes more than a chant, how a market becomes more than a spreadsheet. Then we will walk into the present tense and live with the consequences. Prices, uniforms, stadium lights, customs kiosks, the shape of your paycheck, and the sound your name makes at a courthouse. The border still breathes in front of you. The officer raises a hand. The glass reflects your face and a flag you didn't expect. If one stroke of law and a string of copper could have kept this line from hardening, would you cross? You start where the spine cracked. Distance. You wait on a coast where gulls circle warehouses and news rides the trade winds in the hull of a ship. Letters are old by the time they arrive. Authority is older still. A governor in Lima argues with a minister in Madrid whose orders took months to cross and more to return. You feel power dissolve along the wake. Logistics doesn't just move goods, it decides loyalty. When storms close the Atlantic, laws grow soft. When seasons shift, taxes slip. You learn the first rule of empires: geography taxes attention. You touch the legal skin, and it stings. The world is sorted by birth. Peninsulares with the highest offices, criollos rich but locked out, castas parsed in ink. Indigenous communities both protected on paper and drained in practice. The system swears it is Christian and paternal, then bills you for tribute. You stand in a cabildo and watch petitions pile up because a surname born in Seville outranks a lifetime earned in Quito. You can smell why revolt becomes rational, not because people hate a crown in the abstract, but because the court stamp does not recognize their face. Money is a mountain. Cerro Rico at Potosi glows like a cold sun, spilling silver that pays for dynastic wars and glass and palaces you will never see. The fiscal model is extraction first. bullion shipped out, goods shipped in, local industry smothered by monopoly and tariffs that convert colonists into smugglers by arithmetic alone. You watch caravans guarded like marching banks and ask who mines the ore, who breathes the dust, who owns the mint. An empire that pays its soldiers with metal mined by men who never own metal is strong until the vein thins or the revolt begins. Trade flows along a single funnel. In Seville, the Casa de Contratación tallies ships, registers cargo, polices who trades with whom and when. The rules promise order, but the monopoly creates hunger. In the late 18th century, the Bourbon Reforms try to modernize the machine. New intendants, new viceroyalties, some liberalization of trade, a spike in revenue that looks like competence. You feel the cresting pride and the backlash. Creole elites see Madrid reorganize their world without inviting them to draw the map. To the crown, reform is efficiency. To the provinces, reform is extraction with better handwriting. Across the Pacific, a galleon out of Manila cuts water for months to reach Acapulco, the ocean stitched to the ocean by a single silver thread. The Manila galleons make Asia and the Americas touch, but they also make dependence visible, break one route and a dozen markets gasp. You stand on the dock and count the crates and know that a war in Europe or a typhoon in Luzon can starve a city in New Spain. Connectivity without redundancy is a brag that turns into a bruise. You listen to priests speak Guarani in reductions deep in Paraguay, teaching reading and music and crops inside a shelter of organized faith. The Jesuit reductions look like a prototype of inclusive administration. Indigenous leadership trained, violence reduced, economies planned at village scale. Then the order is expelled and the experiment ends. You note the pattern. Whenever local competence grows, metropolitan anxiety follows. The empire prunes the very branches that could carry weight. You read a promise that doesn't land. The Cádiz Constitution in 1812 declares equal citizenship across the empire and invites American deputies into a single, modern body. The ink is warm with possibility. Then political tides in Spain repeal, restore, dilute, stall. You watch the promise flicker. Rights discussed as if the distance were short. Rights applied as if the ocean were still a moat. Your patience curdles. If equality can be printed but not delivered, what language is left but separatism? You feel the social physics of soldiers and shopkeepers and lawyers choosing sides, not for theory, but for leverage. In Mexico, the Plan de Iguala offers independence wrapped in monarchy, and guarantees to religion, unity, and the rights of groups who fear both imperial return and radical change. It is a compromise forged by danger. Hold the middle or watch the extremes burn it. Elsewhere, the compromises fail, and the empire fractures by region, by grievance, by who can afford to defect first. Outside, pressure arrives with a handshake and a warning. The Monroe Doctrine tells Europe to keep its hands off the hemisphere, while British commerce funnels capital and goods into the vacuum. You feel a new structure settle in. Not formal colonization, but an economic order that rewards those who align northward. The old imperial center cannot compete on speed, credit, or ships. Even when Spain modernizes, it is often too late or too broke, or too tangled in its own politics to project stability across an ocean already spoken for. You run your finger along the calendar and see abolition stagger and stall. Puerto Rico frees enslaved people in 1873, Cuba in 1886. Steps that come late and leave scars. Every delay keeps a wound open and gives rivals a moral club to swing. You imagine being asked to fight for a flag that waits to admit you fully human. You imagine saying no because dignity does math too. Debt gnaws, war bills mature, bond markets punish hesitation. Revenue squeezes provinces that already feel pinched. Elite factions quarrel over who pays and who profits. Bureaucracies grow complex enough to be both necessary and hated. You hear the sneer in a tavern and the hush in a church and the silence of a field where the harvest went to a port that sent promises back. By the late 19th century, technology begins to make distance blush. Railways knit interiors. Steam replaces wind. Submarine telegraph cables turn months into minutes. Spanish ironclads like the Numancia circle the globe, and prove that steel can carry a flag where wood could not. You stand on a pier and hear the telegraph click and think, this is the first time speed is on our side. But timing is cruel. Political crises in Madrid, the aftershocks of La Gloriosa, and the thunder of 1898 converge to make capability irrelevant. When a state needs calm to exploit new tools, it gets storms instead. Panama sits like a hinge in the middle of everything. French ambitions sink in mud and disease. Later, American hands carve the canal and claim the leverage that comes with it. You feel the strategic gut punch. Whoever controls that cut can price time itself. The map teaches you the same lesson over and over. Choke points decide futures more than speeches do. So the fractures make sense, not because people were small, but because the structures were slow, unequal, extractive, and outcompeted. You watch borders harden where trust failed, currencies wobble where credit fled, identities sharpen where inclusion lagged. You don't need to romanticize anything to see the inevitable. You only need to imagine one different lever, pulled at the right moment and pulled hard enough to lock. Which lever? The one that turns equality from parchment into payslip, that turns a shipping monopoly into a customs union, that turns months into minutes. What if one legal stroke and a few cables cut through this? You choose a lever and pull until it bites. Cádiz, 1812, not as a flirtation, but as a contract you can enforce. You stand in a crowded hall and hear a sentence that redrafts your life. Provinces across the ocean are not colonies. They are provinces of the same body. No more peninsular priority by birth. No more second-tier citizenship by longitude. You watch the Cortes seat deputies from Mexico City, Quito, Lima, Bogota, Buenos Aires, Manila. The oath is the same. The vote counts the same. The Constitution does not sleep between sailings. You feel the mechanism lock. The Council of the Indies is dissolved and replaced by a Ministry of the Commonwealth with two co-equal headquarters, Madrid and Mexico City. So, orders never cross an ocean alone. Audiencias stop doubling as political governors and become appellate courts. Provincial parliaments sit in Mexico, New Granada, Peru, Rio de la Plata, and Chile. You see a revenue-sharing formula engraved in statute, half to the province, 2/5 to the Center for Common Defense and Telegraphs, 1/10 to municipalities by headcount. The rule is simple enough to explain in a tavern and strict enough to prosecute in court. You can hear tax receipts click into a ledger instead of evaporating into discretion. You open the customs code, and it is new. The Casa de Contratación is abolished, not by rupture, but by conversion. Its clerks become a board of customs and ports that manages a common external tariff and free circulation within. Smuggling loses its romance the moment legal trade becomes faster and cheaper. Cádiz stops pretending to be the only mouth of the Atlantic. Havana, Veracruz, Cartagena, Callao, Valparaiso, and Montevideo are recognized as co-equal lungs. You step onto a quay, and for the first time, the seal on a warehouse door means access, not obstacle. You sign a law that schedules freedom and funds it. A phased abolition statute pledges manumission bonds and freeborn status going forward, ties compensation to years of service already rendered, and imposes deadlines that cannot drift. Puerto Rico complete by 1873, Cuba by 1886, with earlier emancipation for those who enlist, teach, or join civil works. You build a freed person's land and credit office that allocates small plots near railheads and port towns and opens civil service exams to anyone who can pass them. You listen to the Army Band at a graduation parade where surnames from Seville and San Juan share the same roll call. How long does justice take? Long, but a timetable turns a sermon into a plan. You rebuild the state to hear languages it once ignored. A bilingual civil service statute mandates recruitment targets and training in Spanish and at least one of Quechua, Guarani, or a Nahuatl, depending on the district. You visit a normal school in Cuzco, where a secular curriculum borrows the administrative discipline once seen in Jesuit reductions, local leadership trained to run schools, clinics, and municipal accounts, without cloister or coercion. A judge in Asunción presides in Spanish and repeats in Guarani. A tax notice arrives in both tongues. A census taker is paid more for bilingual skill. Dignity gets a budget line. You accelerate time. A telegraph and rail fund is capitalized with a dedicated slice of silver and customs revenue and issues bonds redeemable in Madrid or Mexico City, paying interest not with hope, but with tariff receipts. Overland wires run Veracruz, Mexico City, Acapulco. Coastal lines climb the Andes and descend to Pacific ports. A trunk runs Bogota, Cartagena, and Lima, Callao. By the 1860s, submarine concessions laced the Atlantic and Caribbean, Cádiz to the Canaries, to Cape Verde, to Recife, to San Juan and Havana, to Veracruz and Colón, with branching to Cartagena. When a governor telegraphs a budget, you count the minutes instead of months. Pattern interrupt. What happens to rebellion when delay disappears? You change the way ships breathe. Steam replaces wind in policy, not just poetry. Coaling stations become the empire's ribcage. Las Palmas, San Juan, Havana, Veracruz, Colón, Callao, Valparaíso, Montevideo. The Numancia circles the globe in 1865 and comes home as a proof, not a parade. Ironclads are no longer trophies but doctrine. Armored cruisers assigned to paired oceans, with Ferrol and Cartagena feeding the Atlantic Squadron, and Havana and Callao anchoring the hemispheric wings. When oil begins to replace coal, bunkering contracts update, not uproot. Logistics stops being a rumor. You make choke points, pay rent. Panama is treated as a hinge and governed by a transatlantic commission, where provincial and central delegates hold joint vetoes over concessions. The empire buys equity in the Panama Railway in the 1850s and negotiates most favored transit for mail, troops, and bonded cargo. When the canal question hardens later, neutrality is declared a common interest with an imperial enforcement clause. Any flag may pass, but the toll schedule favors the customs union, and armed protection is collective. South, you invest in the Magellan route as a failsafe, lighthouses pecking at darkness, repair yards at Punta Arenas, meteorological stations that tell captains when not to die. You turn monopoly into market. The common external tariff shelters infant industries in Puebla, Buenos Aires, and Medellin. A standards office harmonizes weights, measures, and patents. A development bank lends at below-market rates to textiles, rail workshops, telegraph factories, and shipyards that meet procurement quotas. You step into a rail carriage stamped with 3 names, built in Bilbao, assembled in Veracruz, paid for by a New Granada loan syndicate, and realize that capital now circles inside the Union before it leaks out. You harden the soft parts of law. A Citizenship Act makes imperial nationality indivisible. A passport issued in San Juan is valid in Seville. A lawsuit filed in Quito can climb to a Supreme Court that sits alternately in Madrid and Mexico City. Military service rotates units across oceans so that a Galician sergeant has friends in Lima and a mestizo artilleryman knows the streets of Cádiz. You enforce civilian supremacy with budget rules that cap provincial standing armies and fund a shared navy first. You are building not just borders, but habits. Foreign pressure does not vanish. The Monroe Doctrine stares, British credit beckons, but speed and inclusion change bargaining positions. When Washington warns Europe away, you agree and add a clause. Hemispheric self-rule includes Commonwealth continuity. When London offers loans, you borrow in shallow sips and repay on time because tariff revenue now arrives like a tide, not a storm. Your ports are not hostages. They are partners. The point of divergence is not romance. It is leverage. You do not avoid every crisis. Drought still hits. Earthquakes still break masonry. Commodity prices still slump. But now, a customs union moves grain without bribes. A telegraph summons engineers while the dust is still in the air. A bilingual civil service calms crowds with words they recognize as theirs. A Navy convoy escorts fuel through weather the map forgot to mention. You feel the margin widen between a hard week and a lost decade. Does inclusion smother separatism? Not always. Some elites still find independence fashionable when taxes come due. Some provinces still calculate that a smaller flag means a larger podium. But the math is worse for exit when your vote holds weight at the center, your language is heard in court, your goods cross borders without tribute, and your cables hum at night. Secession is a luxury purchase. You've made loyalty the cheaper good. You look back at the hinge moments. Cádiz enforced, Casa converted, abolition scheduled, telegraph funded, ironclads based, Panama leveraged, and you feel how each solved constraint knocks a tooth off the old gear of fracture. You look forward and see a passport that moves you without apology, prices that don't lurch with every squall, stadium nights where rivalries run on sport instead of flags. You ask yourself the only test that matters now. Is this Commonwealth legally equal enough, fast enough, and rich enough to out-incentivize secession? Enough that, when the speeches end and the bills arrive, you still choose to stay? You wake in a capital that shares its power. Session weeks rotate between Madrid and Mexico City. But the building you pass every day is yours, a glass and stone chamber where deputies from Quito and Cádiz, Lima and Seville, Santiago and San Juan argue through microphones that switch languages as easily as hands. You hear a speech open in Spanish, pivot into Guarani for a paragraph when the debate touches land rights, and close in Spanish again for the vote. The bench behind the clerks carries a crest you know by muscle memory now, a crowned globe gripped by anchors, older than the Bourbon Reforms, but tempered by the shock that made Cádiz matter. The old promise of equal citizenship stopped being parchment. It became payroll, pensions, and the way your case number climbs a docket shared across an ocean. You queue for security and flash a passport that functions more like a key card. The chip inside is tied to a common citizenship register. The lines that used to split your family at airports have been replaced by one green lane that reads Commonwealth Domestic. You think about how the Casa de Contratación once insisted every cargo pass through one mouth, and you smile at the reversal. Now, the whole interior is duty-free. Your bag of coffee crosses 3 frontiers without a single stamp. Your customs form is an app, and you pay a flat rate for shipping across territories because the tariff schedule belongs to a single outside wall, not a fence between neighbors. 1 passport, 3 oceans, 90 ports. The math feels like gravity. Your paycheck arrives, and you notice what doesn't arrive with it, the old lurch in currency. The digital real Hispanico sits in your wallet app beside your local notes, and the central bank keeps it inside a narrow band with rules you can diagram on a napkin, commodity basket, export receipts, and a stabilization fund seeded by lithium, copper, and oil. You still grumble when prices climb, but the climbs are slopes, not cliffs. The same grid that your taxes feed is the grid that softens your bill. Interconnects run Mexico, Guatemala, Panama. Leap across the Caribbean to Puerto Rico and Cuba. Fall along the Andes like a steel river, and meet the southern cone where wind and gas trade time with hydropower. A drought in one basin used to mean candles. Now it means a control room shifts loads before dinner goes cold. You hear a hum you never noticed before and realize it is the sound of redundancy. You sit in a classroom because tuition reciprocity turned ambition into logistics. Your niece studies engineering in Bogotá, with a bursary underwritten by a development bank you can describe. Funded by customs revenue, governed by a rule that channels soft loans to districts willing to meet apprenticeship quotas and build to shared standards. Workshop floors in Puebla shape the same components assembled in Rosario and tested in Bilbao, stamped with a little triangle mark that says compliant from Lima to León. You shake a box of screws and feel policy in the threads. You walk to a clinic where the triage nurse greets a grandfather in Quechua and a teenager in Spanish without switching tone. The bilingual civil service statute that sounded like overreach when it passed now feels banal. Your municipality finally hires for skill you can hear. When the census taker visited your grandmother, she answered questions in her first language and cried once, quietly, because she realized the form wasn't testing her. It was seeing her. The Jesuit reductions taught the empire a template it ignored. Today the template is secular, public, and paid on time. You take a night train because the airline prices spiked for a holiday, and the timetable reads like a confession of geography learned and mastered. The names trace the old telegraph trunk lines, Veracruz to Mexico City to Acapulco, Cartagena to Bogotá, Lima to Callao. Only now the message is steel. You watch the coast slip past and think about how submarine cables once turned months into minutes. Their grandchildren are fiber, laid along the same seabed tracks, meeting at the same choke points that mattered when Numancia took her iron skin around the world to prove a point. You scroll through a port tracker and see ships queuing at Colon under flags from every market that counts. Pattern interrupt. Who prices time when a canal toll shifts by pennies? You dip into a stadium where rivalries hoard anger and release it as songs. The league crosses seas. A mid-table side from Guayaquil draws a powerhouse from Andalusia on a Tuesday, and you go because you can. The chants feel like a federation more than a fight, and even the jeers are learned in common. When your team wins, you walk home through a crowd where accents slide like light on water, and a police line doesn't bristle at your face because the line looks like your family does. Law didn't cure hatred, but representation clipped its wings. You file taxes, and the portal reminds you where your money goes. Port dredging in Montevideo, grid upgrades near Oaxaca, a bilingual teacher cohort for the Chaco. You can click through to a dashboard that shows customs intake this quarter and the share sent to emergency funds. The rule that half stays local, 2/5 flow to the center, 1/10 return by headcount has survived enough elections to be boring. Boring is the word you use for stability the week after a hurricane, when your lights stay on and a convoy rolls past with water and radio mast parts. Boring is what your children will call heroic. You travel north and you feel the push-pull that defines adulthood between giants. The United States remains your largest single external customer and competitor. The Monroe Doctrine grew old, but didn't retire. You sit in a meeting where a canal throughput clause becomes the entire agenda, and you watch your delegation and trade lower tolls for energy exports guaranteed through the winter. A week later, you listen to a senator in Washington rail about subsidies and then vote for a bill that locks in supply because his district needs heat. Pattern interrupt. What do you call rivalry that keeps you fed? You cross the Atlantic and land in a continent that speaks your language on one flank and courts you with markets on another. The EU treats the Commonwealth like a cousin with a large household, sometimes generous, sometimes exasperated. Spanish MEPs speak with a volume that carries farther because their politics echo in 20 capitals west of the ocean. You sign a research agreement in Seville that pays for a wind lab in Patagonia. You board a flight to Asia and walk a pier in Busan, where cranes you partly finance load electronics, bound for Veracruz and Callao, while a delegation from Manila negotiates a new cable route that respects an old history. The Manila galleons are photographs now, but the line between Pacific and Atlantic still runs through your books. You stop on a mountain road in the Andes and buy a battery for a motorbike that costs less than you expected, because lithium didn't all leave as dust in a container. The internal capital market did the one thing slogans never could. It made staying more profitable than exporting raw. Copper smelters sit next to engineering programs. Oil royalties fund vocational schools. Tariffs prioritize components over luxury sedans. You know the compromises. Some industries are fat with protection. Some regions complain they subsidize others. But you also know the last 3 recessions were shorter than the ones your parents feared. You argue in a bar because pride is a renewable resource. A friend says the Commonwealth takes too much and gives too little. Another says it saved his factory when orders dried up. You point out that your cousin moved from Oaxaca to Cordoba without paperwork and sends pictures of a preschool with 2 flags in the foyer and 3 languages on the wall. The bartender wipes a glass and says the quiet part. The thing works because it made leaving expensive. You all nod because you know he means secession, not last call. You cut across a public square and pass a small protest where signs switch languages mid-slogan. The court answers a week later with a narrow ruling about land and a wide statement about respect. And the city exhales instead of bracing. The Constitution you used to treat as furniture still moves. The chamber you mocked still convenes. The Navy still sails in pairs past straits where insurance rates drop when your hulls appear on a screen. The ironclad became a missile frigate, the telegraph a fiber route, the customs house a trade API, but the logic is the same. Fixed distance, fixed dignity, discipline money, and you buy time against entropy. You sit on a seawall at sunset and count ships. A bulk carrier from Antofagasta moves like a patient animal. A Coast Guard cutter follows a line only the crew can see. Somewhere beyond the curve of the world, a convoy waits for a window at Colon. Somewhere in an office, a graph of lithium futures climbs a little too fast. Somewhere in a capital, a finance minister stares at a bond spread and forces his breathing to slow. You used to think crisis was the opposite of normal. You know better now. Crisis is the test of whether normal was earned. The wind shifts. A notification vibrates. An alert about canal delays. A rumor of tariffs from the north. A surprise export tax floated in a province that thinks it deserves more. The stadium lights hum. The grid holds. Your passport is warm in your pocket. When time gets priced higher overnight, who pays? Who passes? Who blinks first? Night folds over the Caribbean, and a message lands like a stone in your palm. Canal throughput down 40%. A landslide after heavy rain. A cyber probe on port systems. Shipping insurers twitching. Hours later, a northern legislature threatens a tariff on subsidized lithium and copper if tolls don't drop for their carriers. You feel the pressure arc from Colon to Congress to your grocery bill. Time just got priced higher. Who pays? You don't wait for speeches. The enforcement clause you wrote into the canal statute wakes up. The Transatlantic Commission convenes on a secure line. 2 votes from Madrid, 2 from Mexico City, 1 each from Havana, Cartagena, Colon, and Valparaiso. You vote neutral passage, surge safety crews to the slide, and publish a temporary toll schedule that favors the customs union only by queue priority for food and fuel. To cool tempers, you open a window. Any carrier, U.S., European, Asian, can buy priority at a premium that funds dredging and slope stabilization. Price becomes policy. The fury doesn't vanish, but it has a receipt. Escorts sail. A paired patrol of frigates clears a lane where rumors were starting to choke risk officers. You don't saber rattle, you insure. The insurance markets notice. Premiums stop climbing. A joint notice goes out in Spanish and English that your Coast Guard and a northern squadron will deconflict patrols for 90 days. You draw the line at sovereignty, then draw another at pride. Cooperation is cheaper than collision. You turn to the lithium front. Exporters in the Andes want to answer tariff threats with a boycott. And the street loves the sound. You love results. The Development Bank offers a countermove, an energy for transit package. You guarantee winter gas and power exports north at fixed prices if the tariffs pause, and in return, your grid gets financing for 2 interconnects that were stuck in committee. Your leverage isn't purity, it's supply people need before dawn. A week later, the boycott chant becomes a duller word, memorandum. You take dull. Dull keeps factories open, money wobbles anyway. A major province chokes on short-term debt it used to roll without sweat. Bond spreads widen and you taste metal. The central bank opens Commonwealth swap lines that calm liquidity in hours. The finance ministry triggers the revenue-sharing floor. Half stays local, 2/5 go center, 1/10 per head. Then advances next quarter's transfer, so hospitals pay vendors and teachers don't get IOUs. The condition is public and brutal. The province must audit its procurement and accept a temporary hiring freeze above essential services. The governor curses you in private and thanks you on television because the lights stayed on. Costs arrive. Fuel taxes tick up for a quarter. A shipload of appliances costs more. Growth slows a half point. In a border valley, truckers who live on thin margins block a highway and chant in 2 languages that feel like a single grievance. You send police and mediators in the same convoy, the first to keep the road clear, the second to listen. A bilingual civil servant kneels by a driver and explains the toll plan in plain words. The protest lasts a day, not a week. Integrity doesn't mean softness. It means explanation backed by math and force held on a short leash. Culture flares. A broadcaster calls the priority queue colonial cosplay. And your cousin nods at the TV until a clip runs of refrigerated medicine moving past holiday furniture, and he stops talking. You let the clip do the arguing because mortality measures policy better than slogans do. You leave critics room to return without humiliation. They do. Weeks pass, the slope stabilizes. The canal works at 85%, then 92%. The temporary premiums sunset on schedule, And you cut a ribbon on a new bypass trench that drops transit time by 6 hours in storm season. The Northern Tariff Bill dies in committee not because they love you, but because their voters love groceries. Your province meets its audits, and the hiring freeze lifts with a small ceremony where no one smiles because dignity returns quietly. You walk back to the terminal that opened this story, and the glass reflects what you've learned. Crises don't end, they down-tick. You keep a navy so insurance stays human. You speak more than one language so crowds cool. You design taxes to move faster than rumors. You accept that sovereignty is a negotiation. You win by being useful. The officer checks your passport. The line is shorter than last year. Outside, a ship horn rolls over the city like weather. You ask yourself the only question worth asking when maps pretend to be fate. Now that you've seen how much work it takes to hold a seam together, would you still choose the line? If this is the world you want to keep testing, evidence first, imagination with rules, subscribe to What If Wars. We'll keep pulling levers you can feel.